Welcome to Two Roads, a program of art and science, with a nod to Robert Frost. Behind the camera today is Richard Anderson, who also doubles as our science guy. I'm Ed Bearden, Modesto's Poet Laureate. Together, we're Two Roads Productions. We have as our guest today Gillian Wegener, a great poet and a very popular host of the second Tuesday nights at the Barking Dog. Gillian tells me that she's had a long interest in poetry and has also studied voice. In 2006, 2007, Gillian won top prizes in the Dorothy Sargent Rosenberg Poetry Contest for poets under 40. And we'll find out more about that as we welcome Gillian Wegener to Two Roads Productions. And thank you very much, Gillian, for being our guest today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let's begin with something that I've been discovering about many of our local artists, and that is that people who write also paint, they also play the piano, they also are very good photographers,
Right.
and sometimes they write books. They're prose people and not just poets. And I noticed that you sing, or you studied voice, or at some time voice was important to you.
Absolutely.
Could we start with that?
Sure. Yeah, when I was in high school and then in college and after that, I studied voice with several different teachers, both at school and outside school. And yeah, I sang a lot of Italian art songs and German art songs. I did a recital when I graduated from college.
Sounds like opera?
It sounds a lot like opera, not quite as full voiced as opera. A little more nuanced, maybe. Not nuanced is the wrong word, but a little more mellow.
A little more mellow?
Yes.
Not so loud?
Not so loud. There's more room, because you don't have to project to the entire theater. There's more room for voice modulation. So.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, it was a lot of fun. I haven't done that in quite a while now.
How do you think music and singing has affected your poetry?
I think it's definitely taught me a lot about presenting poetry to an audience, about projection and voice modulation and all that kind of thing. I think in writing poetry, it's given me a sense of breath in a poem and the importance of the pause. It's given me an appreciation for that moment of silence, like a rest. But I think, yeah, most importantly, it's the breath in a poem and allowing breath to have an important part in the poem itself.
Well, I think it does all of those things. I noticed it when you are hosting at the Barking Dog and you're introducing someone, and you generate a lot of enthusiasm by the way you bring somebody up and say, this is a wonderful poet, and this is a marvelous poet, and you're going to enjoy this person a lot, and I love that, and it's good for the whole group. When did your interest in poetry develop?
I started writing poetry when I was in junior high. I had some spiral notebooks that I carried around with me all the way through junior high and high school, and I kept writing poems, and I was sort of that weird girl who wrote poetry, and that was just kind of what I did. And I went through college and didn't write a whole lot in college. I didn't take any creative writing classes. I mostly focused on English and on voice. And after I came to Stanislaus County to teach, I began to write more seriously again. And I went to the University of San Francisco for graduate school in their poetry program, and so I really began to take it seriously then. It felt like something that I could really do.
And that was a master's in literature, but not the master in fine arts.
It was not at that time they did not have a master's of fine arts. It is now an MFA. At the time, though, it was a master's of arts in writing, and for me it was an emphasis in poetry. For others it was an emphasis in fiction or creative nonfiction. So
I've never understood how it got to be a Master of Fine Arts, but because they had all the tools already,
right,
and they taught
right.
the same subjects. Now you teach right now junior high.
I do. 8th grade English.
8th grade English, and it's junior high when you discovered poetry, discovered your own writing.
Absolutely.
Okay, can you tell us what poetry is?
I think that poetry is an intense distillation of image and emotion. And one thing I love about poetry is that there is no room for anything extra. Every space, every image, every word, every punctuation mark absolutely is essential. And I love that. I love that kind of the minimalist nature of poetry. We live in a very cluttered world, and poetry helps to make the world more orderly, I think. And I always tell my students a good poem is like the best raspberry in the whole world. Raspberries are my favorite. So it's like the best raspberry in the world. It's beautiful, it tastes good, everything about it is wonderful, and it's just so small and expressive. So
Best raspberry in the world. So that's your definition of poetry, the best raspberry.
The best raspberry in the world.
That's really wonderful. Could you possibly share 2 or 3 poems with us?
Sure.
So we can have an example?
Sure. Last summer, my family and I went on a driving trip through Oregon and back down through Northern California, and we went on the Avenue of the Giants. So I wrote several poems about traveling on the Avenue of the Giants, which is something I hadn't done for quite some time. And so there are 8 stops along the way on the auto tour, and this is stop number 2, Bowling Grove. Each ecosystem makes its own set of rules, coordinates for this, logarithms for that. In this canopy, at the axis of X being the limb and Y being the trunk, the years accumulate their treasures of fallen needles and twigs. The mat builds and builds. The air grows more humid above it with its spongy corridors, with its microbial cities. Salamanders move in with their small possessions to feast. The hawks land and survey the silvery distance. And a dogwood tree grows ownerless and lovely 200 feet up, its roots clenched tight in the limb of the redwood. The arboreal salamanders will live out their lives up there, their small black feet never once touching the ground. In the afternoon breeze that carries in the fog, the dogwood claps out a soft applause, exponents for continuing this existence.
Very nice.
Thank you.
Now, you lived in Northern California for a while.
I did. I lived there when I was a child, and I went there again for college.
Okay, and that's some of what you're writing about here.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I was amazed when we were up there how much of a hold that coastal redwood area has on me still. So it felt very much like home. Should I read another one?
Yes, please.
This is stop number 4. It's a stop at a town that's moved now, but it's called Wiat. The town is gone, washed out in the Christmas flood of '64, when the river in which they fished, in which they swam, in which they paddled tin canoes, the South Fork of the Eel, next to which they built bonfires, next to which they kissed, while the moon kissed the river, down which they sent logs to the mill, over which they built the bridge, next to which they built the town, described as bustling that December, when it rained for days, and the river rose 33 feet above the highway, and took what it wanted, and it wanted nearly everything, and left just the sidewalks, which you can still find if you look hard enough, and are schooled in the ways of persistence and memory. And the town of Wiat, there is a town of Wiat, it's just kind of moved to a less flood-prone place. But you can still look at the sidewalks in this kind of wiped-out town.
It's wonderful.
So,
You read it so well.
Thank you. Thank you. It's really a fascinating place.
Well, it's fascinating the way you read it. Read us another one.
Sure. This is stop number 7, Chandler Grove. My father-in-law is dead, but here he comes from his walk on the trail. It's a short walk, and he's winded but shining. The redwoods, he says, looking up, the redwoods. The sun pours through them, mineral-like and grand. My father-in-law leans against a tree, raises his small black camera. There is a click, and he's gone, of course, and we are left with what's here. The redwoods winding up and up, the canopy, a great cantilevered cathedral ceiling, and from somewhere up there, wing flutter and chattering from a thrush we never see.
I really like those.
Thanks.
The first time I heard you read, it was, I don't know, it might have been as long ago as 5 or 6 years at the State Theater. And Jeremy Schumann read, I remember, and Lee Nicholson, who used to teach poetry at Modesto Junior College, read. So there were quite a group of you. That Sam Piersdorf, I believe, was there. And you read a poem entitled "You Be the Nude." It was a pantoum. and I was so impressed with it. And then later I found it in Ledge magazine.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked you, I remember saying, "Now, is that a particular form, pantoum?" And you said, yes, it was.
Yeah.
You use the form much?
It is my favorite form to write in, but I don't use it that often. I don't usually write in form. It's very good for getting started. If I'm having a hard time writing, if I'm having a hard time kind of entering the world of the poem, a pantoum or any form, but I love pantoums in particular, are very helpful for kind of just moving me into the right frame of mind, forcing me to use language in a way I wouldn't ordinarily use language, and just kind of making me sort of more open to thinking like a poet again.
Pantoums have a lot of repetition.
They do.
And the repetition alone is pretty, I think. It appeals to me, at least.
Right.
You've also published pretty widely. What sort of places have you published?
I've published in quite a few journals. I've published in a lot of local journals. I've been published in Penumbra, and then a journal that was in Stockton for a while. A couple of times in Quercus Review, and I'm just starting to kind of publish at a sort of a wider realm. So I had some things published or accepted. They're not out yet, by Sauzier, which is in Virginia, and something from the West Marin Review just recently. So just keep trying to send things out. When I send things out, I sort of automatically think they'll be rejected. That's sort of my way of shielding myself from what is almost inevitable, because 90% of what we send out comes back. So
and you've published a couple of books.
I have. I published a chapbook called "Lifting One Foot, Lifting the Other." This was published by In the Grove Press in 2001. Lee Herrick is the founding editor of In the Grove Press, and he's always been very supportive and very encouraging about my poetry. So when he decided he wanted to start a chapbook series, he invited me to submit one. There are lots of egret poems in there, so my friend Jim Paris did the illustration for me.
And you have a book you've published?
I do. The Opposite of Clairvoyance came out in 2008 from 16 Rivers Press, which is a collective press in the Bay Area. So I was really thrilled. It was a submission, a manuscript contest, that it was one of 2 books that were chosen there. And so I felt really honored and very excited to have that published.
Gillian, you mentioned 16 Rivers Press is a collective publication. I'm not sure I know what that means. Can you tell us more about it?
Absolutely. 16 Rivers is a press that was started by 7 women poets in the Bay Area about 1999, and they wanted to provide an alternative route to publishing. So they decided that they would pool all their money that they usually sent out to contests and establish a press and publish each other's work over the next several years. So starting in, I think, 2001, they started publishing 2 books a year. And eventually they were able to invite in other poets through a manuscript submission contest. And now they've published, I think, 22 books, mine being one of them. But the members of the press do all the work of the press. So I do a lot of their online materials. I manage their Facebook and their blog and their email newsletter. But everybody has chores that they do, and that's how we keep costs down, and we're able to continue publishing new work.
Well, that's a really good idea. It's very expensive, I think, to send a manuscript out and then wait for it to come back, and then send it to somebody else and wait for it to come back. And I read these little vignettes in Poets and Writers magazine,
right.
And there'll be a new book published, and they'll say, "How many times did you send it out?" Once in a while, oh, the first time.
Right.
But most of the time they'll say 23 or 29.
Mm-hmm.
They've sent this manuscript everywhere until it finally gets published. And that would cost more than you'd ever make from the book.
So true. So true.
So this is a wonderful idea. And you've been doing this for how long?
I have been involved with 16 Rivers Press since 2006.
2006, 4 years.
Yep.
Can you tell us who are some of your favorite poets?
Sure. My favorite poets really fluctuate with my mood and what's going on, but Brenda Hillman is a Bay Area poet who is always a go-to poet for me. It was reading some of her work that made me think, yeah, I can do this. I want to do this. And so she is more of she's quite an abstract poet, much more abstract than I am. But I love that every time I read her work, I see something new and different and interesting in it. So I really appreciate her work. I love Forrest Gander's work. He's a poet from Rhode Island, and he's just really wonderful. He's got a very scientific eye, and I love when poets are able to combine biology or botany and poetry, and you know, they are able to look at the precise details of whatever it is they're looking at and use that language and that science in the poem. I think it is fascinating. So those are two of my go-to poets.
Those are two of yours. Now, when you mentioned Brenda Hillman, you said that you thought you could do this or you thought you could write. How old were you when you were reading her? Let me take that question
back.
back.
Okay, that's all right. I have no problem about age.
About what? Were you reading Brenda Hillman when you were in not elementary school but middle school?
Nope, I was definitely reading Brenda Hillman as an adult. I was already living here in Modesto, I think, and searching out other poets and poets beyond who you hear about in school. So
Shakespeare and Pope and
exactly. So poets that spoke more to me as a young woman in California, rather than to an English teacher, which I also am. And I do like those poets, but I wanted a poet who spoke to me, and Brenda Hillman was that poet.
Well, I remember I liked your language there because it reminded me of Philip Levine. I was at Fresno State College at the same time he was there, and I found a book of poems entitled "New Poets of England and America," edited by Donald Hall. He edited a couple of those, and then something I think just with America, but he did a lot of editing. And there were 4 poems entitled "The Negatives" that Levine wrote, and I read those poems over and over and over. And it was the first time in my life. I'd had all the other stuff, the Shakespeare at junior college and some of the other things.
Right.
But here I thought, I can do that. And it was that moment of discovery that was so exciting. I can do that.
Absolutely.
And never as well as he did, but
well, it's a feeling akin to falling in love, really. I think it's a feeling of wanting to commit yourself to this art. I wanted to write, and I was going to try hard to write, not like her, but to find my own voice.
Well, there's a Gestalt therapist who says that all learning is discovering that something is possible. That it's once you discover it's possible, then the rest is easy.
Right.
But I don't know, and I think that's right. It's been right for me. How has Brenda influenced your own work?
I think her earlier poetry influenced my work a lot in that I thought, people can write about the landscape right around them. It doesn't have to be, what you write about doesn't have to be the big romantic sort of, death and love all the time. I mean, I think most poetry ends up in the end being about that, those two anyway. But you could write about a street in the suburbs in California. You could write about, the tiniest details of the lake. She had one poem particularly about taking a walk around Lake Merritt in the Oakland area. And you could write about just something that ordinary. And in its ordinariness, it would become extraordinary. It would become universal. But it didn't have to start off being kind of those big name title ideas that people think poetry is about. And I think that was really what made me kind of wake up and start paying
Well,
more attention.
William Carlos Williams wrote
Absolutely.
about simple things.
Absolutely.
About
And I
simple
did read
things.
him quite a bit when I was in middle school and high school.
Well, I never found him in middle school.
Yeah.
I do remember memorizing The Highwayman.
Mm-hmm.
The road was a river
Yeah.
of darkness over the purple moor, and the highwayman came riding.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's good stuff.
I love that.
Um,
And my mom read that to us when we were little kids, and I have very clear memories of all the tlot around the dinner table.
around the dinner table.
Yeah.
I've sort of stolen that and put it into some of my own
Oh,
poems.
good.
Well, how do you ever not find a use for something like trelot?
Right, right.
I read Kurt Vonnegut a lot, and you read Kurt Vonnegut at all?
I've read not very much.
Not
a little
very
bit.
much. He said that writers, and he's speaking of himself, but he's generalizing a little bit too, and he said, writers are nitwits. And he says, we spend too much time alone. And when I was reading some of the biographical information you sent me, you talked about the aloneness that it takes to be a writer. You want to enlarge on that at all?
Yeah. Writing is definitely it's definitely something for introverts. You know, you have to be very comfortable in your own mind and in your own head, I think, to do the work of a writer, because you do spend a lot of time alone, a lot of time in very focused, intense work, and you can't have other people in conversation with you during that. And so it can be quite lonely, but you know, when you're in the middle of a poem, and you know this too, I'm sure, when you've got the poem and it's working and everything's going well, you know, the rest of the world kind of drops away.
Yes.
And that is not the lonely part. The lonely part is coming up with the idea and getting started and pushing through into what you eventually know will work as a poem. So,
You're really right. When you have a poem and it's working for you, even if it's not finished, that's not lonely.
Mhm.
That's exciting.
Right.
That's fun.
Right.
I've often told people that nothing is quite as interesting to me as what goes on in my own head.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, it's like these pictures are behind my eyes all the time.
Right.
And the problem with that is that sometimes I don't pay enough attention to other people.
Mm-hmm.
I get to doing my own thing there,
Right.
and they think I'm just ignoring them, and really I'm writing a poem or thinking about something interesting,
Mm-hmm.
or see something funny that I don't dare say.
Right.
You're such a mentor. You're such a mentor to other people. And I don't think it starts with your classes. You might have learned to do it there, but you're a mentor to your middle school kids, your 8th graders. You encourage them. You've bought them poetry books.
Absolutely.
And I think your word was you wanted to enlarge their horizons in terms of poetry. I don't know if you keep those in your classrooms or you send them home with them, but it probably doesn't matter. They have access to them. They can read them.
Absolutely.
Their future is enlarged
I hope
because
so.
of what you've done. But then there's what you're doing at the Barking Dog. The second Tuesday night poetry readings at the Barking Dog. And there's this wonderful group of poets who come, sometimes new poets, sometimes obviously new poets,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes people who are probably not poets, but they're all welcome. They can all come, they share,
Mm-hmm.
you encourage them. I'm just so impressed with that part of you,
Thank
that
you.
nurturing, that mentoring.
Thank you.
Well, how do you come by that?
Well, I think that a lot of it is having been a teacher for as long as I have. And I don't know, maybe some of it comes from being a mother. And I should say my family's going to come to the door. But I think a lot of it is just a love of poetry. I love poetry, and I think that our poetry community here is so incredibly vital and exciting and interesting, and I just want to keep nurturing that and keep fostering that in our community. I think poetry makes the world a better place. I think poetry makes us all better people, and I want to encourage others to just really open themselves up and love poetry.
Could you read another poem, please?
Sure. And it was published this past year in the Dirty Napkin,
Okay.
an online poetry journal. It's called America by Train, and it's based on a trip I took cross-country by train on my own a few years ago. America passes by the window like a set of slides being shown too fast. Here are the desert scenes with long stretches of blank landscape, but you know that it's all in the details. How the gray-green cactus will open up the most beautiful pink flower for just one day, but you'll never see that flower from this train window. How the lizard will wait on its rock for the unfortunate cricket to land and become a tiny meal. You won't hear the screech of the hawk welcoming sunset, or see the startle of the dormouse and hearing that cry. What you can see is brown and gray and vaguely green, with the wide, darkening sky overhead, and it's like holding a book you know will be a good read, but that you aren't allowed to open. But here are the passengers, their unchosen details out for display. The man and wife who argue about every little thing in hard whispers and then loud voices, not quiet shouts, not much softer, but not really meant for the entire car to hear. She has something to say about how he shaves. He has something to say about the way she cooks turkey. She is wearing a yellow hat, 50 years too late for yellow hats with small cloth daisies, and he has a cane that he whittled himself, and they're going from Bakersfield to Kansas to see her sister. And he has something to say about that too. Another passenger peels an orange. Another says he was attacked by dogs in Indonesia and is going home to get treatment. But the sores on his arms and face don't speak of dogs, and the gloss of fever means everyone, for the most part, leaves him alone. And what he wants most is a mug of tea, but because he is so weak, he decides to wait it out. And another passenger walks ahead for a smoke, and a baby sleeps on her father's shoulder, and the conductor reads a magazine and wishes he were elsewhere. And America passes by like that in the night when the windows show nothing but passenger reflections. It becomes New Mexico. It becomes Oklahoma. It becomes a train moving through a world made up of nothing but darkness, punctuated by the little comma of moon overhead. It becomes a train standing still as the world moves past. The arguing couple grows quiet, her head on his shoulder. The feverish boy sleeps and murmurs with feverish dreams. The baby is awake and watching her own reflection in the window, waving at her sweet new self as the night folds around us.
This is Ed Bearden with Gillian Wegener and Sophia Wegener. And
Sophia Orlando.
Oh, Orlando. I'm sorry,
That's
Sophia
okay.
Orlando and Astra.
Yeah.
Asta. Okay.
Asta the poetry dog.
In the words of Robert Frost, 2 roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both. Today we've traveled with Gillian Wegener, teacher, poet, host of the second Tuesday poetry reading at the Barking Dog Restaurant. This is Ed Bearden's, Modesto's Poet Laureate, saying, keep traveling. You never know when you're going to meet your next poet.